Our session is looking at the national carrier conundrum. But during the preparation for this panel, a very valid question was raised in terms of when we talk about a national carrier, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a flag carrier? Are we talking about a government airline? Are we talking about a private airline? So I think first, let's just clearly define in terms of when we say a national carrier, what we are talking about. And I'm going to give the question to each one of the panelists, but Ian, maybe if I could start with yourself, maybe just to lead that off in terms of a national carrier, as you see it.
Yeah, I think when we look at a national carrier, we have different types of national carrier. We could look at Ethiopian Airlines, they're 100% government. We could look at Kenya Airways, they're predominantly private. We could look at someone like Swiss in Europe, and they're 100% private, but they're still considered the flag carrier. So my thinking was that for the benefit of this discussion, we should define what type of national carrier we're looking at. Are we looking at a carrier that is 100% government, or are we looking at a different type of national carrier? And a flag carrier can be very different to a national carrier.
Yeah. Theodore, we can ask the same question to you. How do you see it?
Thank you for the question. It's a question that calls for a contingent answer. Because if you look at the American definition, a national carrier is tied to revenue that should be able to turn over between $100 million and $1 billion in a year. That's a national carrier. But in the African context, restricting ourselves to, sub-Saharan Africa, the national carrier is supposedly an airline that, let me use my country, Nigeria, like the defunct Nigeria Airways, that is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the government. But that is not the comprehensive, analysis of what a national carrier is. A national carrier can be owned part by the government or by private investors, is kind of a merger, or even be owned by private investors, provided it represents, shall we say, the altruistic intention of the nation that has it. Now, a flag carrier, on the other hand, in my view, okay, now, I'm sorry, let me take a little bit of your time again to say that most of the time in sub-Saharan Africa, I always emphasize, the national carrier is always more or less like what you call a legacy operator. And that's the beauty of Rwanda Air for that matter, because Rwanda Air to me is like a network operator. That's the way I understand it. Maybe a hybrid operator. But the flag carrier must not necessarily be legacy. The whole idea of a flag carrier is an airline that is most likely should be private owned, but has demonstrated in a functional, utility efficient way that it presents the domiciled country where it comes from or where it originates from in a positive sense and gives perhaps some level of global or international approval, and therefore is designated as a diplomat of sorts for the country. That's the way I want to put it.
Yeah. Dico, if we can come to you.
My answer is actually very short. A national carrier, to me, it's an airline that's owned and run by the government 100%. If we try to get into the nitty-gritty, we'll spend quite a lot of time trying to debate what is or what is not. So for the purpose of this discussion, I'd say a national carrier, to me, is 100% owned by the government and 100% run by the government.
Yeah. Can I come to you last? Because in terms of Rwanda Air, it's a very particular case, and I've got a specific question there. So maybe if I could ask you just in terms of your views in terms of what exactly a national carrier is. So I'll come to you straight after.
All right, so the lawyer in me says that there's no wrong answer from what we've heard. All the answers there are correct, but I think I'll just add another dimension to it, which is how do these carriers, whether they're national carriers, 100% stock, lock and barrel owned by government or a portion, or they're flag carriers, how do they present? Yeah. And I think that really is the issue. And what is the level of engagement and or interference from the government in these carriers?
Because in the case of Rwanda Air, if you have a look at it in terms of both a flag carrier, national carrier, and also then I would put it to you in terms of a tool in order to develop the country, providing access, flying strategic routes. How do you see a national carrier?
Thank you so much. Before I come to that, I think if we can look around and see what the airlines are categorized as maybe a national carrier. Yeah. Look at the KLM. It's categorized in that as one of the national carrier. Look at the Emirates. Look at the Ethiopia. So then the way I perceive or the way I see a national carrier is an airline that is either set up by the government, then directed by the government, then the government is like a caretaker. Yeah. When there are problems, when there may be some big decisions, maybe some direction, then the government can come in and say, okay, no, this is what you need to do, this is the direction. Because a national carrier is also identified by a nation as one of the pillars of the economy. So if such a carrier, an airline is identified as one of the pillars of a nation, especially on stimulating economy, especially on improving connectivity, especially supporting, then I would define it as a national carrier. It doesn't necessarily mean that all decisions are done by the government. It doesn't mean that day-to-day management is done by the government. It doesn't mean that you cannot take your own decision in terms of route profitability, in terms of the fleet, in terms of everything. But as soon as you're identified as one of the key elements in the national development, as a pillar of a nation, then for me, the definition would say this is a national carrier. Yeah. So coming back now to Rwandair, if Rwandair is identified as an airline that will improve connectivity in Africa, improve connectivity in the region, and also offer services to anybody coming to the airline. And then if the government is there as a caretaker, then I would define it as a national carrier. That's how I perceive the national carrier. Yeah. Yeah.
And how much of a fine line is it in terms of then being of strategic importance to a country and having particular routes which may be strategic, but not necessarily as profitable or maybe needs to be subsidized, versus then having it more purely on a commercial basis? Yeah. Where does that trade-off come? I know it's a difficult question, but where does that come
in terms of maybe routes, in terms of the connectivity, in terms of opening up route, we do the analysis on the route and say, okay, this route is good, this route can be profitable, this we need to improve here, but the government can come and say, we need to connect here, we need to connect there, we need to improve this connection, but you also come back and say, no, we need also to put this in place in order to open up such a route. So it is both ways. The government can give you maybe a direction, but also you put in the commercial perspective, and then they also give you a chance to drive everything. Yeah.
Ian, how do you see it in terms of a national carrier, flag carrier, if you then will, in terms of how commercial it should be operated versus particular requirements of a country?
I think the sadness is when you see national carriers that get subsidized by the government to the extent where the airline receives more money than health or education, because it's more of an ego trip than something commercial. I also think what is very sad is when national carriers use their power and their government to the detriment of the private carriers, and it's not a level playing field. I do see a need for national carriers. I just worked for Air Djibouti. There was no private investment for an airline, so the government decided they had to do it. And it was successful. But you look at neighboring countries and you see there's one airline and no private operators. That's wrong.
Yeah. Theodore, from a private sector perspective?
Well, I usually don't like stressing manifest facts. But the point remains very clear that, to me, if you were to go by Sophocles in the classic Greek drama Oedipus Rex, he said, and I quote, that when wisdom yields no profit, then to be wise is to suffer. And therefore, in the sub-Saharan context, going by majority, in matters of conscience, really, or truth, the law of majority really doesn't count, but going by majority, the national carrier idea has not done that well. My impression is, my position is very strong. I even said it yesterday, that if, and that's a strong if, you really want to go that way, from my experience in Nigeria and what I've seen over the region, then you have to dummy responsibly, effectively, the model that Ethiopian has gone through, Kenyan Airways, Rwanda is doing now, South African. And what is that? There is an effective mix of professionals. There are cohesive, functional, key performance indication monitored alliances with, I wouldn't say foreign, I would say professionally run companies.
Yeah.
If we can do that, not the misnomer that we had in Nigeria called Virgin Nigeria. It's not personal. I have my reasons for saying that. We need a functional mix of professionals and a team that will sit down and do the needful, not to run the kind of national carriers we've seen that suppresses competition, that allots all the profitable routes to themselves, that gives all the rebated tickets to very wealthy officials and ministers who can afford it. This is why I always call it hygiene and human factors. Those bureaupathology is the problem. And if it can be suspended indefinitely, which is a very big if, maybe I'll go that way. My position is I will always favor the flag carrier.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good point in the discussion to introduce the concept of air services. You know, sometimes we can get bogged down in, you know, the boxes, national carrier, flag carrier, what have you. I think the important thing is if a country or a region has adequate and robust air services. Yeah. And what do I mean by that? It shouldn't really matter, provided that whatever model, business model we're looking at for air services is run as a business. It shouldn't really matter whether it's a national carrier as defined or a flag carrier as defined, or even a totally private entity without, you know, any flag. It shouldn't really matter. That is really the focus. And in the context of Africa, if I may say, the platform that I mentioned in the other sector, the Yamoussoukro decision, it allows intra-Africa cooperation across states and amongst airlines. And that's what I mean by air services. So in the past, we saw some examples. Arik Air, which, you know, people have mentioned several times, it was given flag carrier status by Sierra Leone, meaning we don't have a carrier, so you come and offer air services for our people and, you know, offer services across the region. That's the kind of thing where we should be seeing more of. Now, as Theodore said, the graveyard of African aviation is littered with traditional legacy national carriers. Yeah. And if you look at the trends around the world, everyone seems to be moving away from that. All right, so you can infer yourselves what that means. But I think the main point there is if government interferes in those businesses in a way that is detrimental to their sustainability and growth, then of course they can't survive. And of course, when governments get into fiscal challenges where they have to allocate resources, all of a sudden, the airline may not become or be that critical strategic pillar because it has to allocate its resources wisely. Yeah. And so the important thing is air services. And in the context of Africa, the right kind of air services. So running it as a business, Ethiopian, we've seen, is a fantastic example. And I always use it as like a poster child for how to do it right. It is a 100% government-owned airline, but the government does not interfere in the running of the business. They, you know, they have a 30-year business plan, and they review it every 5 years. Yeah. They adapt, they're flexible. They have their people who are homegrown through the system, so they're not coming from outside, you know, people who don't know anything about the business running it. So it's a good way. And they have been consistently profitable for the past 18 years. So this is the way to do it. It shouldn't matter.
But could you then, in an African context, see that there would be a particular country that would be happy to have no national carrier, flag carrier, whatever the case may be, but be happy to be serviced by whatever regional airline could best provide it with the connectivity, whatever other options it has? Is that a realistic option?
Ghana comes to mind. It is. So Ghana does not have a national carrier.
Yeah.
There was a time when there was Nigeria Airways and Ghana Airways, right? And when they were both struggling, I don't know, for those of you who remember, the air services between the two countries was checkered. If you missed your flight on one day, you were stuck for 3-4 days, okay? And then all of a sudden, the Ghanaian government, this Open Sky, the platform I'm talking about, the Yamoussoukro, they said, well, let's sign this agreement amongst ourselves. So there was a time when Nigeria had 5 carriers with 3 to 4 flights a day into Ghana. Opened up the markets between the two. Businesses opened up across the two countries, et cetera, et cetera. So the socioeconomic development was there. But yes, that's a practical example. And today, Ghana still does not have a national carrier. And they've opened up fifth freedom to as many people who are interested in coming. So, yeah.
Iko, to bring you in here, in terms of that kind of scenario, so now you have got a number of airlines. It's a highly competitive industry in terms of that. Is there enough players? Is there enough space in order to then create these airlines or to utilize existing airlines to grow them to such a point that they then can service what is required and not necessarily need to have a national carrier per country or flag carrier per country?
Absolutely. And I think to what Funke was talking about, air services, it's quite important. Most national carriers in Africa have tried to build themselves to be like KLM or Air France or Lufthansa and haven't taken into effect or into account their local environment and said, how do we build something that actually allows our people to travel long distances a lot faster, a lot quicker, and very, very affordably? I wrote an article just as the current Minister of Aviation was announced as Minister of Aviation called National Carrier, Go Big or Go Home. And the point of the article was not supporting national carrier in itself, but it seemed like it was an inevitable thing that was going to happen in Nigeria. And I said, if you're going to form a national carrier, don't try and be like Emirates. Don't try and be like Air France. Create something that actually reflects who we are and what we need. And across the region, in West Africa in particular, we have lots of countries that need air services, can't afford to put together a national airline, and are clearly taking strides and making steps towards allowing other carriers coming and support their market. And I hope to see that happen a lot more across the continent as a whole. It's good to see what Rwanda is doing, opening up another base in Benin Republic next door to us, Nigeria. It's great because it allows more competition in the region. It lets people move around a lot more easily. And once we understand in Africa that our greatest trading partners are our neighbors, then we'll start to move a lot faster, a lot quicker, and making things happen faster.
Yeah, and from a Rwandan perspective, that decision in order to then establish a national carrier or a flag carrier, rather than going open skies and saying, let's invite somebody in. What was the kind of decision? Did it come into the reckoning? How did that come about? Why go down a particular route in terms of rather establish a national carrier than open skies?
Yeah, thank you so much. The reason that was driving the decision to set up a national carrier in Rwanda is about the landlocked of the country. We know Rwanda is landlocked, but that's not enough. You can be landlocked, but you cannot be airlocked. So the decision by the government was say, okay, we are landlocked, but we can still open our routes in the sky and then be connected to a different destination of the country. Yeah. So that was one of the main driving factors that we are here, we are landlocked, but we needed to have a solution, and the solution was Rwanda. So that's one side of it. Then second part of it, as you also asked, whether African countries really need a national carrier by nation. Of course, that brings its own challenges, but I think one of the solutions that can address this is joint ventures. If maybe a bloc or maybe 2 countries or 3 countries can come together and say, okay, I cannot manage an airline on my own, but you've already started, then we can come together and then put up something together, put up all our efforts together. That's one of the solutions. Then on the also issue of the roads, opening the roads, and then if we see that maybe we need to connect our people to this destination because we have people moving here, people maybe bring goods here, we need to take our goods to this destination. And then you do your commercial analysis, you look at the revenue, you look at the route profitability, and that one is entirely done by the Rwandan management. Then you go ahead and do that. So, as I mentioned, a national career, if a nation identifies that, okay, this is what we need to put in place, it's good for us, it's good for the population, and then let's try to set up this, then the management will be separate, but we will keep an eye on this airline, we will keep an eye on the growth of this airline, then that's fine. So, I think that's where the main driving factor of setting up Rwanda, and then to improve the connectivity in the region and in Africa.
Absolutely.
Okay. Ian, if I can come to you, in terms of that regional cooperation and opportunities and so on, have you seen opportunities that could materialize? Is there something that is obvious at this stage in terms of where things could happen, or is there a lot of challenges still? How far off are we in terms of getting to that kind of cooperation on a more regional level?
I think there are massive opportunities out there. And I go back to what Germa said yesterday, that at the end of the day, you're going to have a lot of niche carriers. Now, these niche carriers, they'll provide the feed for the bigger carriers. You're going to have probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 hubs in Africa, and they will feed through to smaller airlines. The bigger ones will make their choices. You have SkyTeam, Star Alliance, you have One World. They're all looking now for partners. They're quite active in looking to who they can use in what part of the world. And then you have your strange ones, Fly Dubai. They're now incredibly active looking for partners, even with their joining up with Emirates. So I think, opportunities are there, and they should be taken up because they do give you nice revenue streams and they give you nice passenger numbers.
Follow-up question on that in terms of then if we look in terms of making it more affordable and in terms of particularly talk about more low-cost airlines, can that model work in Africa? Is it still to be done? It works in South Africa, but there's a certain income level in terms of air travel. Is the opportunity for the rest of Africa to also go down that route and long-term sustainability?
It works in Kenya.
Yeah.
I see no reason why it shouldn't work.
And the rest of Africa, if we look in terms of...
Well, I think it can work anywhere. I think the idea of a low-cost model now is something that everyone is looking at. Now you have ultra-low cost, and you have the legacy carriers that are also semi-low cost. You look at weird things. I was reading that Emirates is looking to do a tie-up with EasyJet. They already have a tie-up on frequent flyer. Everything is possible now, and why not?
Theodore, do you agree?
I certainly do, because, in my experience, especially, he's talking about the big alliances, which are very nice. My thinking is that we need to right-size our thinking. It's basic logic to understand that a baby gets carried, starts to crawl, walk, run, etc. And so I get worried when an airline starts 2 years ago and they want to start competing with British Airways or Air France, which has been our experience, And again, having walked for quite some time over the region, sub-Saharan African region, I have seen the people to be extremely friendly. I have seen that you can walk over to regulatory authorities and actually get considerable discounts. That was why yesterday when I made a short presentation, I was saying that Yamoussoukro is actually working, because on 3 separate occasions in 3 different countries in West Central Africa, somebody said to me, Theodore, I knew you in Bellevue Airlines, and in the spirit of Yamoussoukro, I give you a fifth freedom. I didn't believe it. He said it twice before I got what he was. And I walked out of there with the fifth freedom. So in terms of alliances, let us even begin to look at local manufactured alliances. Mm-hmm. It's sad that I have CEOs, and I'm sure Diko will grin when I say that, who wouldn't want, a passenger from maybe an airline he worked for to come into mind. And where does that bizarre xenophobia come from? I don't understand it. And secondly, if you pull together, chances are you will have a bigger market. I am an Igbo man, and I'll give you an example that will probably make you smile. The average problem with my people is that we're individualistic. Theodore and Sons, Diko and Sons. But you see, a Lebanese man comes into Lagos, and he has $10,000. He could start a supermarket in a shop. But he gets about 10 Lebanese people. They have $100,000, and they own the street. And all of them are busy. They create work for a lot of people. And they earn maybe $20,000 every month. Makes more sense. Simplistic, functional, direct. You see, my experience has been that there's nothing like making a posture about knowledge. The best examples of success are simple. We just have to go beyond this. My Mercedes-Benz is bigger than yours, as we say in Nigeria. You know? we have to begin to understand that. Okay, I'll give you a simple example. I had issues getting into Kinshasa for instance, Arik Air. But I got talking to a gentleman who had an airline which wasn't flying regional. And we had a very good gentlemanly understanding, drinking the local beer. And Arik was in Kinshasa. It didn't cost me a dime. That's some kind of collaboration, isn't it? So I believe that if I have a machine that could feed and defeed, if you forgive the bad English, out of Rwanda Air, without me necessarily impinging on the effective catchment area and the sectored markets, you know, captive, well, emerging, the ones that are coming and niche. I don't see why we shouldn't have that relationship. The problem in Africa, and I keep saying it, you know, some people hold it against me, but I say I can't point at a white man like you and call you a racist when I have tribal restrictions against my fellow black man. It's the same racism, isn't it? If I dislike you because of your religion, then I have no business getting upset when somebody doesn't like the width of my nose. It's just as bad as that. So the point here is getting very simplistic, which is my own managerial style. We need to begin to look at solutions. We have to look outside of the box. We have to think of win-win situations. It mustn't always be, I have to be seen to be better. It doesn't matter on the long run. What matters is the business surviving. As we say again in Nigeria, I'd rather be a manager of something than a director of nothing. Thank you.
Martin, can I just say something as well? Sure. Talk about low-cost carriers, because you can't talk low-cost carriers and not talk about Jet West. Yeah?
Of course. I wasn't going to exclude your promise.
Nice plug.
Good point. Well, no, seriously, the way we see it, low-cost carriers are coming, and we're coming to address a different segment of the market that's not being addressed today. And from our little vantage point in Lagos, we hope to see an alliance in the next 5 years where you have a Jet West in West Africa, a Fast Jet in East and Central Africa, and a Kulula and Mango in Southern Africa, all working together to open up the airways for our people, to get more people flying. And I really, really hope and pray that that can work, and we'll work very hard to make sure that comes to light.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. In addition to whether the airlines in Africa should be low cost or maybe high cost, okay, there are three philosophies into this. An airline can choose to be a low cost carrier. They say, okay, we pursue this, we offer cheapest services, we don't offer food, maybe we just give you a few bags and then you travel and go. So that's one line of thinking. Another line of thinking is that other airlines like Air France, they say, okay, we are going to be high-class airline, we are going to charge high, and we still get people. And then other airlines think that, okay, we cannot afford being so cheap, but you cannot also afford being so expensive. So I think what we need to look at in Africa is just a convergence. Combining, have a hybrid, look at the maybe low-cost carrier approaches, then you look at this high-cost carrier also approach, then you converge, have somewhere in between where you can meet and say, okay, this is right for us. Then it depends also on the choice. You can offer a choice for those who can afford the expensive tickets, give them the best food, give them the best seat, give them a flat bed. And then those who cannot afford the high fare, then give also them a choice. Give them a seat, give them maybe no food, a few baggage, and then so that everybody fits there. It's like you are designing a shoe for everybody. Yeah.
Can I say one thing, Martin? Sorry, let's clarify something. I think one of the biggest misconceptions when people talk about low-cost carriers is they assume it means low fares. Low-cost carriers is actually an operating model to the airline. It's how we operate. It's our mentality. It's our operating procedures that are low cost. If we're nice and we're kind, we'll pass on the savings to people. But if you come at the last minute to board a flight, we will actually take the maximum that we can out of you from a revenue standpoint. It only makes business sense.
Yeah,
And so I think that misconception needs to be sort of.
And a key element to that is the ability to fly to various destinations on a regular basis, coming back to having access to the various services. I just want to see in terms of how we're doing to time, because I do want to open it up to questions. So I'm going to give each one of you just an opportunity in terms of just a further comment. And then if the audience could get their questions ready, we'll open it up.
All right, so in terms of the kinds of partnerships, like I said, there's room for different kinds of business model. We certainly have enough room in Africa for that. We have the charter services. Those feed into different kinds of models, new model airlines, hybrid, name it, niche, call it whatever. But they feed into different things. So it's a whole chain. You have the charters feeding into the commercial with different aspects of the commercial, and those feeding also into the international. So, everyone stands to win if done right. Now, on the concept of African alliances, I always like to think about using this example. You have 3 of the large carriers in Africa, Egypt Air, South African Airways, and Ethiopian in Star Alliance, but they don't have an alliance amongst themselves. And this is one of the issues, where, a trade association for airlines, but we recognize that we have to speak, talk to ourselves, tell ourselves the truth. And the truth is that airlines need to cooperate more. And there is a need for that. In Nigeria, we have if you buy a ticket and that flight is canceled or whatever, that's it. You have to go and buy another ticket. So even internal cooperation amongst local carriers is an issue. Now, in terms of the opportunities, as you asked, in terms of, where can we forge more cooperation? If you think of so many initiatives that are going on, for example, with Rwanda, Uganda, and is it Tanzania, the open borders, that seems to be a natural place to have an alliance, or to have Rwanda offering services to these other countries that are struggling at the moment with carriers. Those kinds of initiatives are logical places. When you have ECOWAS, like the big blocks, SADC, ECOWAS, etc., there are opportunities within those blocks to offer services amongst each other and to create alliances as well. And, the future that Diko painted of, having even a low cost, if you like, alliance, that's great, and that would be a really ideal model if we can get that. Now, just on the point of low cost and fares, etc., I think it's important to understand that in Africa, it's a high cost environment, whether we like it or not. Just name it: taxes and charges, monopoly situations that drive up pricing. It is a high cost environment, and so it's left to the airlines to find the right kind of operating model that fits within that. One final thing. We talked about national carriers, and it's very easy for us to point the finger at government, but there is also a word of caution for private operators, and we've seen a lot as well, just as the graveyard of legacy carriers is filled with all this stuff. We've seen a lot with private operators as well, and I think just to emphasize the concept of separation of ownership and management. It doesn't matter that you have, $1 billion and you go and buy aircraft. It doesn't mean that you're qualified to run the airline. And so this is something that is really important to note. And when you're talking about partnerships, people want to look at you. They're looking at your long-term sustainability profile. These are some of the considerations that come into play when these are happening.
I want to make a contribution. I do not disagree with the concept of low cost, and I'm extremely, happy with Diko. I call him Bossman because he is very passionate about it. I have a slightly different take, and that's why I keep using this word hybrid. You see, the average African traveler might have issues about comprehending, internalizing fully the whole process of an aircraft dispatch. And for you to succeed, you will find that somebody wants to carry his generator with fuel in it right inside the aircraft. Like, he doesn't understand what the hell you're talking about. I have had to do lectures right in the tarmac, explaining what a trim sheet is all about, you know, forward and aft, and the tail-heavy conditions, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first thing. Now, you're talking about low cost. You'll be shocked to find that a gentleman will opt for a low-cost ticket and then get on board the aircraft and get upset that you have not served anything to him. Because he jumped at the ticket from a target point of view, it was affordable.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, he will let you know that, look, I bought this ticket and I'm entitled to blah, because that's the orientation we've had. Therefore, hybrid. Why? We have people who walk up to us right there in the airport when the go show thing, traffic goes. You know, you pop into the airport and look at the available aircraft and then you run for it. And they say, do you have a business class or a first class? And you say no. And I took time over years. It gives you 15 to 25% of the effective flying public. That's why it's got to be hybrid. On some routes, you have business class. Forget about first class. It doesn't apply. They can forgive you for first class. But some of the people, you call them high net worth people, and they are invariably the people that can afford to fly, will object to flying economy. You see, I look at Facebook now and again, and you see the president of America coming out of an aircraft, and he's holding an umbrella for his wife. And then he's carrying his own bag.
That was
The average African head of state will have maybe 3 people holding 3 umbrellas. I'm sorry, I mean, it's true. You know, let's get to the facts.
Okay.
So I do not see a minister, maybe in my own country, I may be wrong, ordinarily opting to fly economy class when he would. He has the first class option. And people resist change. In the process of even doing a hybrid, where the prices are unbundled, et cetera, somebody with a minus economy ticket will be wondering why the croissant and the coffee, the next person who has a plus economy ticket, is better than his own, or why he's just getting a glass of Coke. And that calls for a lot of talk. And this business is responsive to time. And most of the time, the buying public do not have that level of appreciation. They just want to get to one point. Agreed that somebody would rather fly from Lagos to Kano and pay 5,000 naira. You understand? It's cheap. But he may not understand that that low cost means that certain assumed privileges are trimmed off from the ticket. And the gestation period, the induction period for him to fully understand and accept that change might affect your passenger flow. Now, talking about alliances, I would say again that way back then in the 90s, Bellevue Airlines, for instance, was doing some flights for Ghana Airways and vice versa. ADC was a Sud Transport in Guinea. I was the country manager for Bellevue in Guinea at that time. Arik, I worked for Arik as well. Arik had the Arik Niger, etc. These things can work. The question is, like Funke rightly said, are the regulatory authorities ready to listen to reason? Will we have a better relationship with the fuel marketers? Is government willing and honest to support the airlines without coming at the back and offering, what they call Greek gifts, in the sense that we'll give you 200 passengers, I'll pay in 5 years' time. Airlines don't work that way. So that's the whole essence. It is a consecutive chain of activity involving different bodies, stakeholders that will make it work. Yep. If the government or the country does not support the low-cost mentality, it will fall flat on it won't even take off. But if the government is open to it, the regulatory authorities are willing to take a chance, and the investors are ready, then you will probably begin to get there. That's my position.
All right, I'm going to open it up to the audience, because I think linked to that, do we believe that in terms of, maybe a question that we come back to later, is in terms of whether a particular country would be happy to have its flag carrier or its national airline being a low-cost airline. As you say, would the minister or the president be happy in order to fly on that low? But let's open it up to questions, and then we can go from there. Here in the front to the left.
Okay, we'll head over. It's Jed from Forward Keys. I'm sure you all know him by now.
Thank you very much. I'm really interested in the discussion here on low-cost carriers. And I take on board your point, sort of saying that there has to be a hybrid for Africa because people may or may not be prepared to pay for the extra. My question would be, what is it that's making the African market so different to every other market in the world? Because we've seen low-cost carriers evolve and grow in Asia, the Pacific, South America, Central America, North America, all over Europe. And the model has worked because it gives people choice. If you want that sandwich and that meal, you can absolutely have it, but you have to pay for it. If you don't want it and you want the cheapest possible fare, then you can take that. Why would Africa be any different, do you believe?
Can I just sort of buttress the point you're making now, which is that low-cost carriers don't come into a market to serve ministers or serve people who already fly today. They come into the market to try and grow it. It's all about growth. You know, it's difficult sometimes when you look at a market and you say, yeah, you know, these people have been flying, but they've been flying for ages. So it's the same way that it's difficult for a new entrant to compete with British Airways or Emirates. You just can't, because people who've been flying them for a long time are used to flying them. You're going after people who don't fly today or who fly infrequently today because those services might not necessarily be what they want. They want to go from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So take Nigeria as an example. A road trip from Lagos to Abuja in rainy season can take 13 hours, but a flight is 55 minutes. If you can match or get close enough to a bus ticket, and that bus ticket, by the way, when you're paying for it, you're paying for a bus ticket, but a 13-hour journey, you're going to buy food on the way, you're going to buy drinks on the way, you're going to buy all sorts of things on the way. So when you add all those things together, if you can match a price from an airline standpoint where you've unbundled all the services, and you tell them, I'm unbundling all the services, so you can pick and choose what it is you want or not want, then you're now reaching into a population that up until this point never had a choice or had a chance to do anything. And I think that's sort of where... Can I answer the question?
Please.
Okay. I agree completely with what Diko says, you know, and I certainly hope it works. I would want it to work. But the thing is, we have to focus on stark reality as it affects Africa. I have had the privilege of opening routes, West Central Africa, etc. And I can tell you, you know, in the local parlance that we have what you call English routes, and there are Francophone routes, which is why I said that the name of my company is Jet Afrique, which is an olive branch, the Francophone. I'll tell you another thing. The Francophone travel a lot more than the Anglophone. You know, they have what you call joie de vivre. They like to enjoy life. If you have 10 Nigerians going to Ghana, they might find one Nigerian and give him the money for the ticket. He buys all the cargo and comes back with it. But 10 people from Aviation will go and probably go and dance at a soiree somewhere. That's the mentality. Now, you must understand that people have a different way of, even in a family, people look at things differently. When you step out to the buffet there, everybody doesn't eat the same thing. Some people don't even understand what a buffet means. So there are different levels of assimilation of information. There are different levels of comprehension of the direct import of a point. And unfortunately, in Africa, there is still a level of illiteracy. There is still a level of not so comprehensive understanding of perhaps complex things. Yesterday, I was talking about somebody trying to understand mathematics or statistics in vernacular. My native language is Igbo. How do I say quadratic linear equations in Igbo? So if I'm trying to understand it, then definitely I have to think in English. That's the difference between a fluent English or French speaker and a non-fluent person. It has to do with the way you look at it. Now, the African person, to be understood, has been stampeded to tend to want to be a European or an American. You catch on, you look at the media, you see the youngsters wearing dreadlocks, trying to look like that, but have they evolved to the point of the people they are copying? So there is need for more information. There is need for people to understand what low cost means. I use the word target appreciation. It's cheap, but what is the import of that cheap? ticket. That's why the fight will start inside the fuselage of the plane, because you expected salad and chicken and wine for paying 5,000 CFA or 5,000 naira. I believe that there is an induction period of effectively, gradually explaining these things through adverts, through, well, you know, help desks, etc., so that by the time people go on board, they know what to expect. Even informed travelers do not bother to read the little legal prints on a ticket when there was paper tickets. And oftentimes, you lose a bag and you claim you have $10,000 there, and then they give you the IATA position, and you're shocked, but you have to stick to that because it's on your ticket. So I think that the problem with the low cost is also the rigidity of the regulatory authorities not to want to support the airlines. It's difficult, particularly in my country, to start an airline. And that's why I talked about a consecutive level, a flow chart of understanding. If we begin to look at that to form a product, it's going to work. The legacy airline concept fails because you just want to be like British Airways or like Air France or Alitalia without having the resources for it. Once again, as we say in Nigeria, you cannot have a taste for champagne when you can afford local gin. Thank you.
That's a good point.
Okay.
I think he deserves a round of applause there. His colleague Hassan would like to add a point.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In addition, and to also contribute to your question, in the African context, the African is very hospitable. Now, when you board a flight, or when you come to my house, for example, I will want to give you at least water to drink. So to an African, you board a flight, and you are not even offered water. It's kind of insultive, and let's say, how do I put it now? So it does not really augur well with the average traveler. Exactly. Yes. So, yes, the perception can be changed because you have to, first of all, go through an incubation period of letting the people know of what the low cost, even though low cost in the real sense applies to the airline, not to the flying public. So there must be a period of letting the people know, creating an awareness of what you are bound to get when you board a low-cost carrier. So without that, it may not properly work. That's why those are the challenges the low-cost carriers are facing in Africa. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Hassan. And I think I'm going to come to you, Tunde. Don't worry, I'm coming over. But I just want to add what Deco said is very similar to what I said yesterday, which is we're not taking markets away, we're creating new markets. Now everyone can fly is the Jet West slogan. That is exactly what Ryanair and EasyJet did. As I said, Ryanair now has a 97% load factor and is the biggest airline in Europe. It can be done. You have a rising middle class, and if we can decrease the prices, that they will meet in the middle. And that is the aim of Aviadev, is to bring that down so that we can actually get the population, get Africa moving. The distances are huge. The alternative infrastructure, the alternative ways of moving around really aren't there. And if you were given the option between a 2-day bus ride or a 1-hour flight, there really isn't that option. So, Tunde.
To follow up that quickly, John, I remember when everybody laughed at Kenya. Fly 540, Fly Saks, Air Kenya. ALS, they're not going to survive. Low cost, nobody in Kenya will ever fly low cost. They have grown, they have thrived, and they've done incredibly well. And they're now international. Again, it was educating, it was teaching people. And I wish you all the best because I do believe it will work, Deco.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to take this low cost issue from a totally different perspective, in the sense that over the years, I've been back in Nigeria now 15 years. Before that, I lived and worked in the UK and the US for 15 years before that. And I remember a certain sequence of events that happened in those markets that when they came to Nigeria in particular, I won't even talk about Africa, I'll talk about Nigeria that I lived, when they were happening right before our eyes, it's like, oh, they were never going to happen. The first one that really comes to mind is MTN. When MTN came to Nigeria about the telephony market, who's gonna use phones? They broke their 5-year forecast in about their first 6 months. The big one that I remember specifically in about 2002, 2003, when we were talking about having ATMs in Nigeria for the first time. ATMs being how you get your money out of the wall, for those who use cash points or a different parlance to describe it. I remember people saying, oh, it won't work. There's a lot of crime. People will, they'll attack you. Why would you be getting money out of the wall? Again, it reminds me about some of the business leaders in the past who say sometimes your customers don't really know what they want until you show it to them. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly that comes from Steve Jobs, and it's something that I always remember. You look at things from the perspective that you know and understand today, and it's very, very difficult to take a totally different perspective in terms of how you look at things. This is where JetWest is coming to the market from a low-cost perspective. So I respond to the gentleman that says, as Africans, you need to offer water on a flight. I disagree. Many of us have traveled by bus or coach, even all over the world. I've traveled on buses and coaches all over the world, especially in Nigeria. Nobody offers me water to drink. I have to buy my water. And I have traveled because airlines have been late. I've had to go by road. And yet they'll stop you at the place where you're going to have food, but they're not going to give you water to drink. You have to pay for it. So all we're trying to say is we have to look at this from a totally different perspective, that what we think is not possible today is certainly possible tomorrow. It needs education. It needs awareness. It needs campaigning. JetWest is already doing a lot of this, and we're doing this in a subtle way and a different way that might not be obvious today, but it's being done, and we're getting a following just because of it. So I would like to just finalize by saying that in terms of how you perceive the market, everybody perceives the market in different ways, and that's why market freedom and open skies and how you perceive, how you go after your market is your personal choice. In other economies that are very similar to ours, especially in Asia, the low-cost carrier has worked. Do not see any reason why it will not work here. We just have to be smart to acclimatize it to how we in our culture can respond to it and make sure that it works for everybody. Thank you very much.
Good.
Well, I was just wondering, it seems in this room we all agree, we heard Gurma Waka yesterday saying that there's only room for 4 or 5 bigger airlines in the region, and government should not interfere in the airline market. But I was wondering if the panel has some views to this. I mean, if you look at the plans currently in Zambia, the plans in Uganda to set up new national airlines for what they're worth, in Tanzania equally, where you have an airline providing services, it's a private airline, just like in Zambia, yet the government still want to go down that way of setting up a new national airline. Would the panel have any suggestions to those governments other than not getting interfered? Any suggestions as to how they could make it efficient, perhaps?
Can we maybe ask you to take on that question?
To set up an airline. Yeah, as earlier I mentioned, I think looking at an options of maybe joint venture, if we see maybe a country has an interest in setting up an airline, maybe to have its people connected, and of course there are challenges. Starting up an airline needs a huge investment, but each country cannot manage it on its own. It needs a lot of technology, a lot of experts. You need highly skilled pilots, technicians. You need maintenance. You need a lot of things. So if a country finds challenges in such a situation, finds itself in such a situation, then you can approach somebody who is already ahead and say, okay, can we do something together? Can we do some form of a joint venture so that we start up our own? Yeah. I think that's the way, that's the thinking that should really drive the aviation in Africa. Yeah.
And it can also be done in different ways, because it doesn't mean that Rwanda Air is going to be called Rwanda Air in that particular country.
No. Yeah.
But you're going to be very heavily involved in the maintenance, the management, all of those kind of aspects. That's key to the success of the airlines.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so one more question. We got a killer question. Anybody out there want to ask one more, or make a point, or are we done? Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, panel. It was inspiring. So if Martin would like to obviously invite them all to leave the stage now, and I'll come up and give my closing remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless there is any burning closing remarks from our panelists that you would like to make.
My comment is to do with the regulatory authorities. Sometimes I know it's tough to move on from what you've known for a long time, and a lot of times in Africa, in Nigeria specifically, we complain about how tough it is or how difficult it is. But I like to look at examples globally and say, this is how it was done somewhere else, and maybe we can learn from this. Asia, in particular Malaysia, Singapore, or the ASEAN region, had pretty much what we have today in Africa, where there was quite a lot of protectionism going on by governments to protect airlines, et cetera, et cetera. And when certain airlines came onto the market, what they did was they showed the numbers to the government. They showed that people were crossing from Singapore into northern Malaysia to catch flights because they were more affordable for them to be able to travel. And they showed traffic growth numbers, even though they were working in very tough and high-cost environments, to the government. And the government saw this and said, hang on, this actually makes a lot of sense. So if we actually open up a bit more and allow these airlines or these carriers to work in better partnerships, creating more frequencies into different markets, we all benefit. So we make more money as a CAA. People get to travel around the region a lot more, and everybody wins. So I think an approach that we should also take in Africa is one of, let's show the numbers to our authorities. Let's show them that this is what's happening now, and this is what can happen in the future if we actually all work together to make this a reality for our people.
Excellent.
Good.
Awesome.
So ending on a positive note, I think that the future is bright for African aviation. There is a lot of opportunity with the right model and combination of airlines and air services and sustainability, growth, the right business model, cooperation, alliances. With all of that, and of course, an optimal regulatory environment that underpins all that, I think that the future really is bright. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Well,
short comment.
just a minute. I'm going to end it.
Short comment.
Okay. All I just wanted to say is myself and Diko and Tunde in the first place were colleagues and were saying the same thing in different ways. The question is, Flight 540 survived in Kenya. Why did it fail in Ghana? There's a difference between low cost and low priced. And Diko just said it. Like I've been saying all along, it has to work from the government, regulatory authorities down to the product suppliers. Thank you.
All right.
That's why Flight 40 failed in Ghana, because it was a Kenyan airline that was exported to Ghana. It was not a Ghanaian company.
Obviously, there's lots to discuss over lunch, so I urge you to take that up. Thank you very much to my panelists.